Why does the self-proclaimed worldwide handsome spend more screen time cracking dad jokes than striking a pose? Why did a group built on tightly choreographed, image-controlled perfection end up with a member best known for slurping noodles on a live stream? In an industry where every gesture is often rehearsed, every expression often calculated, why does Kim Seokjin, known to the world as Jin, seem to actively resist the mold? Is it possible that one of the most photographed faces in modern pop culture built his entire career by refusing to act the way a K-pop idol is supposed to act? And if that's true, did it almost cost him everything before it became his greatest strength? Intro. To understand this question, we have to understand what a K-pop idol is expected to be. It's a role built on control. Controlled expressions, controlled interviews, controlled mystery. For decades, the industry standard has rewarded idols who project effortless cool, a certain untouchable polish, whether that's a smoldering visual concept or a razor-sharp performer who never breaks character. Jin, by his own admission and by the observation of millions of fans, has never quite played that game the same way. This isn't a story about talent, and it isn't a story about failure. Jin is one of the best-selling solo artists to come out of the group that redefined what a boy band could be on a global scale. This is something more specific and more interesting. This is about the gap between the image an industry expects and the person who kept showing up instead. A gap that for years drew skepticism, a gap that ARMY, the devoted global fan base built around BTS, eventually turned into one of the most beloved personas in the entire genre. So the real question isn't whether Jin is talented, it's whether Jin ever actually fit the shape the industry tried to put him in, and what happened to him and to the idea of what an idol even is, because he didn't. Let's start with the moment everything could have gone differently. Kim Seokjin was not looking to become a singer. He was a university student in Seoul, majoring in acting and film, with dreams that pointed toward the screen, not the stage. He had already brushed off one scouting attempt years earlier as a teenager, assuming, reasonably, that a stranger offering him a contract on the street was running some kind of scam. Years later, walking off a bus near his campus, he was approached again. This time it was a casting representative from Big Hit Entertainment, the company that would go on to become Hybe. He was invited to audition, not as a singer, not as a dancer, but as a potential actor based almost entirely on his appearance. He said yes, and somewhere between that audition room and his first day as a trainee, the plan changed. Big Hit didn't cast him for a drama, they cast him into a developing boy group that didn't have a name yet. He arrived with no singing background, no dance training, no experience even remotely resembling the years-long grooming process most of his future groupmates had already been through. This is the detail that makes Jin's origin story different from almost any one of his bandmates. While some of them had already been writing raps, performing in dance crews, or training since childhood, Jin's specialty walking through that door was simply his face. That single fact would follow him for years. Every K-pop group divides labor. There's a leader, a main vocalist, a main dancer, a maknae, the youngest, and often a visual, a member whose primary early function, at least in the eyes of marketing, is simply to look stunning in promotional material. Jin was given that label almost immediately, and for a while it seemed to define the outer limit of what people expected from him. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from being introduced to the world as the pretty one. It suggests, whether intentionally or not, that everything else is secondary. Early in BTS's career, some fans and critics openly questioned whether Jin's vocals could keep pace with the group's increasingly demanding discography. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was the natural skepticism that follows anyone whose starting point looks more like luck than preparation. But this is only the beginning of what made Jin different. Because instead of trying to disappear into the visual role quietly, dignified, and camera-ready and silent, Jin did something almost nobody expected. He started making jokes. Constant, corny, sometimes groan-worthy jokes, on camera, in interviews, during choreography breaks, in the middle of serious conversations. And that decision to be visibly, unapologetically uncool in an industry built on cool is where this story actually begins. In 2016, Jin launched a simple, low-budget web series called Eat Jin, a self-produced mukbang or eating broadcast where he sat in front of a camera and ate. That's it. No elaborate concept, no polished set, just Jin, a spread of Korean home cooking or takeout, and a live chat window scrolling beside him. On paper, this should not have worked as an idol strategy. Mukbang content at the time belonged largely to independent internet personalities, not to members of one of the most tightly managed acts in the industry. There was no dance break, no wardrobe change, no mysterious lighting, just a guy eating, talking to whoever happened to be watching. It became one of the most beloved recurring pieces of BTS content in the group's history. Why? Because it revealed something the industry rarely allows to surface, an idol simply being a person, not performing charisma, just having it by accident, while chewing. Jin's easy, self-deprecating humor on these broadcasts, laughing at his own jokes before anyone else could, teasing himself as much as anyone else, became for a huge portion of ARMY their entry point into loving him specifically, not just BTS as a whole. This is where the misfit question starts to sharpen, because Jin wasn't failing to be a typical idol, he was actively declining to be one, and audiences responded by loving him more, not less. There's a particular irony sitting at the center of Jin's public persona, and it's the nickname he gave himself, Worldwide Handsome. He didn't wait for the media or fans to crown him with that title. He said it on camera with a straight face as a joke about his own looks, a joke so blunt and so confident that it looped back around into being charming rather than arrogant. It's a small moment, but it says something large about how Jin operates. Most idols in his position, genuinely, objectively striking, marketed from day one primarily for their visuals, tend to either lean into a serious, untouchable mystique or downplay their looks entirely to seem humble. Jin picked a third option. He named the elephant in the room himself, then made fun of it before anyone else could. That instinct, undercutting his own image before the industry or the public could box him into it, shows up again and again across his career. He is the member most likely to break formation mid-performance to make a face at the camera, the one most likely to answer a serious interview question with a pun, the one who has openly admitted without apparent embarrassment that he doesn't consider himself the most naturally gifted vocalist or dancer in the group. But here's the thread worth holding on to, because we're going to come back to it later. Self-deprecation is not the same thing as low effort. What critics sometimes read as Jin not taking it seriously enough was, underneath, one of the most quietly disciplined transformations in the group. Let's be honest about the criticism, because a narration that only tells you what fans want to hear isn't worth much. In BTS's earliest years, some vocal coaches, reaction commentators, and segments of the K-pop community did point out real gaps. Jin's dancing lagged behind the group's most demanding choreography, and his vocal tone, while distinct, wasn't initially delivering the technical power that main vocalists in other groups were putting out. This wasn't a fringe opinion. It was common enough that Jin himself has referenced it directly in interviews over the years, discussing the work it took to close that gap rather than deny it existed. And that's the detail that keeps this story honest. Jin didn't respond to the visual, not a real performer narrative by getting defensive. He responded, according to his own retrospective comments and observations from members like Suga, by putting in the unglamorous, unfilmed hours of practice that nobody claps for. Vocal training, dance repetition, the parts of idol life that never make it into a variety show. By the time BTS was performing at the scale of stadiums and award shows watched by hundreds of millions, Jin had become known specifically for his high notes, the kind of top-end vocal runs that anchor some of the group's most emotional ballads. The visual who can't really sing narrative didn't just fade, it was actively, publicly disproven, note by note, over the better part of a decade. But this isn't where the story peaks. What happened after Jin left the group, even temporarily, is the part almost nobody outside the fandom actually understands correctly. By South Korean law, able-bodied men must complete mandatory military service, and for years the exact terms of how that law would apply to global stars like BTS remained an open question, one that occupied headlines and government debate. Eventually, a legal revision allowed some of the country's most internationally significant entertainers to delay service until the age of 30. Jin turned 30 first, and in December of 2022, he became the first member of BTS to enlist. There's a version of this moment that could have played as tragic, the group's oldest member stepping away right as their global fame was cresting, disappearing from the spotlight during a run of consecutive record-breaking years. Instead, Jin used the weeks leading up to his enlistment to release his first true solo single, The Astronaut, co-written with the band Coldplay. It became, in effect, a farewell gift to fans before 18 months of silence. He entered military service as an active-duty soldier, later training as an assistant drill instructor. For a year and a half, one of the most recognizable faces on the planet disappeared into a role defined entirely by anonymity, discipline, and routine, about as far from idle as a life can get. In June of 2024, Jin was discharged, the first BTS member to complete his service, greeted at the gates by his bandmates, one of whom reportedly played a celebratory saxophone solo on the spot. Crowds gathered, live streams drew millions of simultaneous viewers just to watch him talk. Within months, Jin wasn't easing back into public life, he was accelerating. He served as a torchbearer in the Paris 2024 Olympic torch relay. He released a full music video for his earlier single Super Tuna, and in November 2024, he finally dropped the debut solo EP fans had been anticipating for years, Happy, led by the single Running Wild. The commercial response wasn't a modest comeback. Happy sold hundreds of thousands of copies within its first day and its first week on Korea's Hanteo charts, topping the year's rankings among solo artists. Running Wild became Jin's highest charting entry yet on the UK's official singles chart and reached the Billboard Hot 100. For an artist who, a decade ago, had been introduced to the world primarily as a face rather than a voice, this was not a quiet vindication, it was a very loud one. Here's where the misfit question takes an unexpected turn, because Jin's solo sound didn't chase the sleek, hyper-produced pop textures that dominate most K-pop output. Happy and its 2025 follow-up Echo leaned instead into British-influenced rock and band-driven arrangements built around live instrumentation rather than tightly quantized pop production. It was, once again, a choice that ran against the grain of what a K-pop soloist is supposed to sound like, and once again, the gamble paid off. Echo debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200, an extraordinary placement for a rock-leaning solo release from an idol background. Jin became, according to industry trackers, the first K-pop soloist to have 2 separate albums each spend 10 consecutive weeks on Spotify's weekly top albums global chart. His single Close to You reached number 1 on Billboard's World Digital Song Sales chart, his 7th chart topper there, reportedly the most of any K-pop soloist on that particular ranking. But this is only the beginning of what came next. Somewhere between the mukbangs and the dad jokes, Jin quietly became one of the most sought-after faces in global luxury fashion. Gucci named him a global brand ambassador in August 2024. Fashion house Fred followed, naming them their first solo global ambassador. Skincare brand Laneige introduced him as their first ever male global ambassador. Athletic brand Alo Yoga signed him that same year.
There's something almost funny about this if you sit with it. The same person mocking his own good looks on live streams while eating instant noodles was simultaneously becoming the face of some of the most image-conscious luxury brands on the planet. The industry that once filed him under just the visual was years later paying enormous sums specifically for that visual, except now it came bundled with a global fan base who loved him precisely because he never acted like he took it too seriously. In mid-2025, Jin embarked on his first solo world tour, Run Seokjin Ep Solo Tour, making him the third BTS member to headline a solo tour of his own. The run spanned Asia, North America, and Europe. Industry chart trackers noted it set new benchmark records for an Asian solo artist's average box office performance per city, and it registered on Billboard's monthly touring charts as one of the most profitable European runs by a Korean solo act. This is the moment worth sitting with. A man who entered the industry as an actor auditioning by accident, who was introduced to the public primarily by his face, who spent years being gently doubted as a vocalist, who built his most beloved content around eating dinner on camera. That man was now selling out arenas across 3 continents on his own name, singing rock songs he helped write. If that isn't proof the shape of idol bent around him rather than the other way around, it's hard to say what would be. To keep this fair, it's worth acknowledging that Jin's path still draws its share of criticism, even now. Some longtime observers of the industry argue that his rock-oriented solo sound, while commercially successful, sits outside what they'd consider the core K-pop idol identity, closer to a crossover pop-rock artist wearing an idol's history than a traditional idol solo act. Others have pointed out that his choreography, even at this stage of his career, remains the least technically demanding among the group's discography, a gap he has never hidden or denied. These aren't accusations of failure. They're observations about category, about whether someone who built his career this deliberately outside the standard idol toolkit should still be measured by that toolkit at all. It's a fair question, and it doesn't have a single clean answer. What's not in dispute is the scale of what he's built, regardless of which column you file it under. During his discharge livestream in June 2024, surrounded by balloons that spelled out "Jin is back" and a table of snacks his fans had sent him, Jin told viewers directly that he had cried during his final military ceremony. Not out of relief to be free of duty, he explained, but because of the people he'd served alongside, people who for a year and a half hadn't treated him as worldwide handsome or as 1/7 of a generation-defining group. They'd treated him as a fellow soldier, just a guy pulling his weight. It's a small, quiet detail buried inside an otherwise enormous media event, but it might be the clearest window available into why Jin built his public identity the way he did. Somewhere underneath the self-mocking nickname, the noodle broadcasts, the constant jokes at his own expense, is someone who seems to genuinely want to be liked for something other than his face, something closer to being known plainly as himself. That, more than any chart position or ambassadorship, might be the real answer to this video's question. Jin didn't reject the idol mold because he was bad at fitting into it. The evidence, the vocal growth, the chart records, the sold-out solo tour, shows a performer who could have played the part convincingly if he'd wanted to. He seems to have simply decided the part wasn't worth playing straight. By the industry's original definition, maybe. He didn't train for years like some of his group mates. He didn't arrive with a singing resume or a dance background. He was, by his own account, cast into a role he didn't audition for, wearing a label, the visual, that suggested his contribution began and ended with his face. But an idol scene shaped entirely by silence, mystique, and untouchable perfection never had room for someone who wanted to laugh on camera, joke about his own looks, and eat dinner in front of millions of strangers just because it sounded fun. Jin didn't fit that shape. So gradually, loudly, and on his own terms, he built a different one, and an extraordinary number of people decided they preferred it. Maybe that's the real takeaway here. Maybe the question was never really whether Jin fits the idol mold. Maybe it's whether the mold was ever wide enough to hold someone that honestly human in the first place. If this look at Jin's journey gave you a new way of seeing him, share it with another army who might need reminding. Sometimes the person who refuses to fit in is the one who ends up redefining what fitting in even means.